So should the fact that 90% silver or junk silver or constitutional silver, should the fact that it is no longer being produced be a deciding factor in your choosing to stack 90% over generic silver? Well, many of you thought that was a big pro of 90% silver that I forgot to mention in this video. And so today I want to discuss that and talk about how much 90% silver is actually out there, because believe it or not, there is a ton of it. So let's get into it, but don't forget to subscribe and help us continue to grow. My channel is sponsored by sdbullion.com. New customers can get their first order of gold or silver at spot by going to sdbullion.com/new. So I want to start by taking a look at the 6 different types of 90% silver that you would normally find in somebody's stack. And of course, there are things like barbers and standing liberty, so on and so forth. But for our 90% silver, generally, if you look in somebody's stack of 90%, they have the more common stuff like your circulated Mercury dimes, Roosevelt dimes 1964 and older, 1964 and older Washington quarters, 1964 Kennedys, your Benjamin Franklin half dollars, and of course, your Walking Liberty half dollars. The reason you find these in the stacks is, like I said, they're a lot more common. Once you get back to standing Liberty quarters, barber halves, dimes and quarters, so on and so forth, the value of the numismatic value, I should say, increases. So generally, those are in a collection rather than a stack. But since we're looking at these 6 types, I want to talk to you about how many were actually minted. Now, before I tell you the mintage numbers, I'll also point out that yes, many people are going to comment, if I don't say it right now, that not all of these are in existence anymore. And I have no idea what the survival rates are actually going to be. A survival rate, for example, is how many Mercury dimes are actually still left after things like the big silver melts, things that have been lost, so on and so forth. How many more are still actually available? But if we'll just look at raw mintage numbers, it gives you an idea of truly how many of each one of these coins were ever produced. So if we start with Mercury dimes, there were, believe it or not, 2.676 billion, that's with a B, billion Mercury dimes produced between 1916 and 1945. That is a lot of silver. In fact, if you look at face value, that's 268 basically $1 million in face value of Mercury dimes produced. Now, if we get into Roosevelt dimes, that number goes up quite a bit. Between 1946 and 1964, when these were 90% silver, they produced 6.595 billion Roosevelt dimes. That is 660, basically $660 million face value of 90% dimes. Now, if we go on the Washington quarters, they produced 3.776 billion 90% silver Washington quarters between 1932 and 1964. That is a face value total of 944 million. That is almost 1 billion face value just by themselves. Then if we look at 64, in fact, let's flip around because I want to start from Walkers because this is actually really cool. So if you look at Walkers were produced all the way from 1916 all the way up until 1947. Now, from 16 to 47, your Walking Liberty half dollars had a mintage of 485 million, which is about $242.5 million in face value. Franklin's were produced for a much shorter period of time, from 48 to 63. They were stopped early because of the assassination of Kennedy. Your Benjamin Franklin half dollars had 498 million produced, which is 249 million face value. And then Kennedy's, why I saved Kennedy's for the last, is because even though Kennedy's were only produced in 90% silver, outside of 90% silver proof sets that started in 92, but as far as circulation coinage, they were only produced in 90% silver in 1964, and they made, just in that 1 year, almost as much as they made in Benjamin's and almost as much as they made in Walker's. In Kennedy's, they made 429.5 million Kennedy half dollars. That is 214.75 million face value. So if you add up all of our common 90% silver coins that we generally stack, that is a face value total of 2.578 billion. $2.5 billion of face value was produced in just 90% silver coins between Mercury dimes, Roosevelt's, Washington quarters, Kennedy 1964s, Franklin's, and Walker's. So yeah, clearly that is a lot of 90% silver produced. But I'm sure many of you are thinking, and I already mentioned it in the video, that not all of that silver still exists. In fact, I would argue that probably 30 to 40% of it, maybe I'm way off, that's not an educated guess, that's just a guess, Maybe we're way off, maybe it's more, but let's just assume that it's 50% of all that 90% silver that we just talked about is no longer in existence. That still leaves $1.3 billion in face value of 90% silver for stackers. Now, if you add to that the fact that most of the people that are stacking 90% silver are your everyday stackers, you don't have the big banks stacking, a ton of 90% silver. They're stacking the 100-ounce bars, the 1,000-ounce bars, the 10-ounce bars, the pure silver. They're not stacking 90%. So that majority of 90% silver that's being traded and bartered is generally going between wholesalers, coin shops, and you and I. So there is plenty of it to go around, in my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. I never get in front of this camera and tell you that I unequivocally know everything, because I do not. Feel free to comment down below if you disagree. It's totally fine that you do. But I look at those numbers and I imagine how much is still available. Then I look at how small of a niche 90% are just silver stacking in general is. And to me, it looks like there's plenty available. Now, yes, if you go back to, the silver shortages, and I don't want to call it shortages because I never believed it was a shortage, really. I really look at it more of as a supply constraint. And what I mean by that is when we had trouble getting 90% silver, it wasn't that we couldn't get it. It's that we had to wait. It's that instead of being able to walk into a coin shop and buy it, instead of being able to order it online and get it in 24 to 48 hours, we had to wait a couple of weeks. We had to wait 3 or 4 weeks, and nobody likes to wait, especially on an item whose price, their value just fluctuates up and down. If you ordered something when spot was 23 and you didn't get it till 4 weeks later when it was 21, it wasn't going to feel very good opening that box, I should say. So I totally get why people looked at it as a shortage, but I always looked at it as a supply constraint, because it was never about not being able to get it. It was just really about how long it was going to take you to do so. So when we had those supply constraints on silver, it wasn't just 90% silver. It was 1-ounce rounds, bars, 10-ounce bars, so on and so forth. 90% silver was just mixed in there with it. It wasn't like there was any additional shortage on 90% silver. And then if you look at the fact that all of the silver, many of you might be thinking that, well, it has historical value. And I did say historical value in that video was one of the pros, but that historical value is not going to turn into numismatic value, because these aren't 1916D mercury dimes. They aren't 32 DNS silver quarters, Washington quarters, which are key dates. These are common date, mass produced, plenty available, 90% quarters, dimes, and half dollars. And none of these are going to ever be in such a demand that they go up anything significant in numismatic value. So really, they're just going to be considered fractional silver for their fractional silver value, which right now is a really good deal. So, which is why I'm actually adding some 90% to my stack right now, because it's basically the cheapest fractional that you can get. But when 90% does get back more expensive to the point where it's just cheaper to buy fractional rounds, say 1/4 ounce or 1/2 ounce rounds, or even 1 gram bars, I'll just move back into that, because like I said already, we're not stacking key date coins here. We're not making a collection of 90% silver. We are just stacking, or I should say I am just stacking 90% silver. I shouldn't assume to know what you guys are doing it for, but I am just stacking 90% silver for fractional weight. So if like I said, if it gets cheaper just to stack those 1/4 ounce, 1/2 ounce rounds, that's what I would do instead when I'm adding fractional in my stack. But keep in mind, when I say all of this to you, I'm not being negative on 90% junk silver. In fact, I very much like it. I do stack it. I just said I'm adding more to my stack because the premiums are low. It's not that I'm being negative at all. I'm just being realistic of why I'm adding it to my stack. So what you guys are doing, who knows? It could be totally different. And you should comment down below and let me know what that is. I would love to hear it. Guys, I will end it here, but I will say if you like this video, do me a favor. Don't forget to subscribe and help us continue to grow. And additionally, I'm going to put a video up above me. If you haven't seen that video yet, it's a good one, and it's the next video you should watch. And other than that, just thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you, and you have a fantastic rest of your day. We'll see you next time.